I was doing an annual review with a client recently, and I was going through some objectives that they had emailed me last year, and they had very organized 2024. There was a list of things that they wanted to work through of their finances. And one of the things written on there was learn more about investments, and in parentheses it said Dow Jones, S&P, etc. So I hop on the call and we start talking, and they start kind of going into, okay, here's all the things I want to address in this meeting. I said, hold on, before we do that, I want to spend 10 minutes to talk about one of your goals that you set out is learn more about investments, specifically the Dow Jones, the S&P 500. So that was the first 10 minutes. I get a message from the client the following day, and this is what, let me read you the message, and this is going to serve as the topic for our conversation today. It said, I was excited when I finally understood what the radio announcer was talking about this morning on my morning commute. All those financial terms made perfect sense to me. I was excited to finally understand. This is a, probably 40-year-old, older, higher 40-year-old individual. Finally understood what the radio announcer was talking about on my morning commute. So all of you have been driving to work or driving home from work, and you hear the news cycle comes on. They say the Dow Jones is up 300 points, the S&P 500 down 2 points, the Nasdaq Composite up 34 points. What does all that mean? And that's what I want to talk about
All right.
in this episode.
So I'm going to throw this out for her asking you that question. I commend her for that, because not many people would ask that question, even though they're thinking about the same thing. So
Yeah.
kudos.
So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna break down, what does that mean? What is the Dow Jones Industrial Average? What is the S&P 500? What is the Nasdaq when the radio announcer says it? When they say the stock market's up 700 points, what does all that mean? So let me start here. There's something called a stock market index. Okay, an index is a collection of stocks that we use as a proxy or something to gauge what the stock markets are doing. Now, by stock markets, well, I don't want to go into too deep here, but stock market, think of the marketplace as like you go to Target. Target's the marketplace. You buy things, right? You're obviously not selling things there, but let's pretend that you can sell things that you make at Target, right? It's a marketplace. It's a place where people go and buy and sell. Companies sell there, you go and buy there. That's what the stock market is. It's markets where people can buy and sell stocks. So an index is a collection of stocks that we use to measure the direction or the performance of the market as a whole. Sometimes people will try to use it to measure the economy. I don't want to get too deep into that, but that's what an index is. So when you hear the radio announcer say the Dow Jones is up 700 points, the Dow Jones is an index. It's a collection of stocks. The S&P 500 is down. The S&P 500 is a collection of stocks that we're using to gauge. And then you also hear the Nasdaq is up or down. It's a collection of stocks. Sometimes they move in the same direction, and sometimes they don't. And we're going to talk about why on this episode.
Mouthful, Eric.
Did you get that?
I got it. It is
Okay.
a
So let's
mouthful. So
start.
we've got three main
We're going to talk about three main indexes.
indexes: S&P 500,
Yep.
the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the Nasdaq Composite.
That's right. Let's start with the Dow Jones, because that's the oldest, maybe the more, I'm not gonna say the most popular, but it's maybe one of the more recognized. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
Do you know the year that it was founded?
1896, 5, 7. Am I right?
Around there. 1882 was the year that it was founded.
It's close. Do you know
So
how many
you were
companies? Do
close.
you know how many companies were on it at first?
12.
12. Yeah. So today the Dow Jones is 30 companies. It's not just any 30 companies. So the Dow Jones is 30 of some of the largest American companies. So companies like, list some for me, Xavier.
Ooh.
Apple, Honeywell, IBM, Intel, Johnson & Johnson, McDonald's, Microsoft, Salesforce, United Health, Travelers, Boeing, Chevron, Cisco. Did I say Coca-Cola? So you can see these are big names that you've probably heard of every single one of the companies on the Dow Jones. So these are big mega companies. So when you hear the Dow Jones is up, they typically will quote it in some type of point. So the Dow Jones is up 700 points. What does that mean? It's a little bit more complicated. I don't know. Xavier's the mathematician of the group, so I don't know. I don't want to get too deep in the math.
Yeah, I
Yes.
wouldn't get too deep in how it's calculated as far as the Dow goes. Any of them. I mean, you're looking at yeah. So let's stay away from that today. We can get
So
into
let's
that
let's
another
let's
day.
just put it. So when they say the Dow Jones is up 300 points, here's what it means. The close or right now, as we're recording this, the Dow Jones is at 38,844. What does that mean? It really there is a meaning behind it, but for our purposes today, if the Dow Jones is at 38,844 points, as of right now, it's down 61 points from when it opened. What does 61 points mean? It actually means it's down 0.16%. So those points that it's up or down relative to its opening value is what's really important. And that's why I like to talk about percentages because, 700 points, what does 700 points mean? What does 30 points mean? It doesn't mean anything. But if I tell you 25 or a quarter percent or
You're going to
1%,
understand that a little bit more than if you come in and look at points.
okay. So Dow Jones, 30 largest companies, 30 largest American companies. That list does change from time to time. Companies, the most recent change, I think, was it Amazon replaced Walgreens? I want to say is maybe the most recent change, and that happened, I think, at the end of last year, possibly. I could
And
be.
so you're talking about change, and
Mhm.
we talked about this off
No, it
air.
was this year. It was this year. Amazon replaced Walgreens this year on the
Okay.
Dow Jones. Okay.
So none of the original companies that were on the index is currently on that list. So
Mhm.
they are changing. Some companies are taking
Dude.
off and they're never coming back on.
Yeah.
General Electric is actually the oldest company on there.
GE. Yeah.
Longest tenure. Yep, GE. 110 years. It's been
Wow.
on the Dow.
Okay. So that's the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones, big 30, some of the biggest companies. There's criteria for what a company has to do to be on there. Another more recent addition. I say more recent. Apple. That's not recent. 2015 when Apple was added. But anyway, actually, GE is not on there anymore. GE was
Are
replaced
they
by.
off? Okay.
Yeah, they were replaced by Walgreens in 2018. Walgreens didn't last too long. On there. But anyway, that's the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The next most popular one, and probably my favorite, is the S&P 500. Now,
So
guess how many companies are on the S&P 500, Xavier?
500, Eric.
Actually, I think there's 503.
503. See,
I,
you
I actually
stumped me
think there's
there.
503. um, the S&P 500 obviously covers more companies, right? So it's more of a
Right.
broad index, okay? Um, and they tend to be very large companies. Now, the Dow companies are oftentimes included on the S&P, are included inside the S&P 500. Now, remember, these are just indexes. They just kind of tell us the direction of the stock market in general. Um, Here's what's interesting, right? We talked about the Dow Jones being really big companies. The S&P is large companies. The Dow companies that are on the S&P 500 index make up about 25 to 30% of the entire index. So the S&P 500 takes in consideration what the Dow Jones is doing.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So the idea is that these 500 companies give us an idea of what the stock market is doing in general.
And if I'm correct, the companies on the S&P 500 don't move as often as the Dow. Is that correct?
I don't know. I couldn't speak to when companies move on and off. There's probably a little bit more. There's a lot more movement on the S&P than the Dow, just by virtue of the fact that there's 500 companies.
Hmm.
Um, but companies will move on. It's not as big of a of a announcement, right? If 10 companies drop off the S&P 500 versus, Walgreens coming off the S&P 500 or GE. I mean, that's like big
Hmm.
news, right?
Right.
Um, it makes you question if you're an investor, you're like, oh my gosh, why is this company coming off the Dow Jones? There's something wrong with that company. I don't want to invest in that company anymore. So that could impact the performance of these companies. So the S&P is a little bit it's less of an announcement when a company
Hmm.
moves off and on the S&P 500. And quite frankly, you will have heard of less you wouldn't you wouldn't have had heard of as many companies on the S&P 500 because it's just more companies. They're not mega caps like the Dow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now here's what's interesting.
And the S&P has S&P 500 or Standards and Poor's. They haven't been around as long as the Dow. So they were founded in 19. Do you know that
60s
date?
maybe in the 60s maybe
1957. Close.
57. Yeah, been around for 60 something years. Yeah. But you can see 500 companies might give a little bit more of an indication of what the entire stock market's doing. Okay. And then
Now tell us why that is your favorite one. Because you mentioned when you started off that the S&P 500 is your favorite index.
I think it's the most commonly quoted. So
Mhm.
when I think of the stock market, I'm thinking the S&P 500 because that's what when most people come to talk to me and they want to talk about investments, they say, "Well, the stock market was up 20% this year." Typically, they're referring to the S&P 500. So it gives us common language, right? They're typically not coming in and saying the stock market was up 20% last year, and they're typically not referring to the Nasdaq Composite, which is where we're going to go next. They may be referring to the Dow 30, the Dow Industrial
Mhm.
Average, but typically it's the S&P 500. So it's just the more common index that I think is quoted more regularly, right? And then the final index that we're going to talk about today is the Nasdaq Composite. This one's interesting. The Nasdaq Composite is considered to be I would say, the more volatile index. So it's going to move a lot more because traditionally, companies that are included on the NASDAQ composite tended to be technology oriented. They tended to be startup companies. So they tended to be a little bit more growth oriented. So in the investment world, when we think about growthy stocks tend to be a little bit more volatile than like the big stable companies like on the Dow Jones that are they're not, yes, they're growing, but you go invest in Chevron not because you expect it to double in value, you expect to get a dividend every year. And you know that it's going to be, here and it's going to weather recessions and it's going to be around for a long time, right? That's why you invest in these
Right.
big names. NASDAQ tends to include companies that are a little bit more growthy, a little bit more tech oriented.
Nasdaq is also based on, it includes both domestic and international companies as well.
Um, I I'm not sure. I'm not
Yes,
sure, but here's
I'm giving you that one. It
okay.
is. Yes.
Okay. Here's what's interesting about the Nasdaq. Okay. I talked a second ago about the stock market. It's a marketplace to buy and sell. The Nasdaq composite tracks, it's an index that tracks the Nasdaq exchange. The exchange is the marketplace where these companies are bought and sold. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into exchanges here, but real quick history as to why Nasdaq tends to be the more, I would say, the more volatile index. The New York Stock Exchange, which some people have heard of, it's a marketplace where stocks are bought and sold. Historically, has been a marketplace for companies that have been around. It's a marketplace for companies that it's got a much stricter accounting requirement. So if you want to buy and sell, right? Again, think of Target.
Mhm.
If you want to buy and sell your product inside of Target, you have certain criteria that you need to meet, right? If you want to go to the local flea market, the criteria is a little bit less stringent to me. Now, I'm not calling the Nasdaq the flea market, but I just want to paint a picture in your mind. Historically, the New York Stock Exchange has been the exchange for the bigger, stronger, more stable companies. So back in the day, when you had these tech companies, these startup companies, they didn't qualify to be included in the New York Stock Exchange. So they went to the NASDAQ, and that's where they were bought and sold. So the NASDAQ, even though a company like Apple, you think, oh, Apple's big and stable, and Apple could qualify to be bought and sold in New York Stock Exchange. Apple trades on the NASDAQ. Now, you who are buying and selling, if you're a client of ours, you never interface with these different marketplaces because of just technology advancements. But that's why, again, the NASDAQ tends to be the more volatile one because the companies included there historically were, didn't meet the financial, the standards, the accounting standards. There were startups, there were younger companies, more volatile companies. So that's why the NASDAQ tends to
Mhm.
be more
So
volatile.
I'm gonna read off the top 10
And these are all big names. I mean,
Right.
I'm gonna let me guess before you read them. Let me guess. Tell me
Okay.
if I'm right. Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Pepsi. No, Pepsi is Pepsi the no
Pepsi's on there.
Pepsi. Which is clearly not a technology company. I'm lost. I don't know any of the other ones. But
Amazon is on there.
yeah, I said Google, but I
Tes-
should have said Alphabet.
yeah. Tesla's
Tesla.
on it.
Yeah.
And Broadcom. Those are your top
Broadcom.
10.
So you see the top 10, like 9 out of 10 are tech companies. Go read me no, well, don't read me here's what's interesting. If we were to read the top 10 of the S&P 500, probably would look very similar. But now you know the differences in these indexes. Now, let me just say this as a caveat as we wrap up here. There are many indexes. Okay, there's a Russell 2000. The Russell 2000 includes 2,000 companies. It tends to be smaller companies. It tends to be more of a riskier or more volatile index because it's small companies. Small companies tend to be more volatile than big companies. There's a Russell 3000. There's a Dow Jones Industrial Transportation Index. There's an index that tracks semiconductors. If you can think of a possible index or something that you want to track, there's an index that exists. They just are not as popular for obvious reasons because they're measuring very specific sectors of the marketplace. Now, here's another reason why I like the S&P 500. Let me just say this: it represents 80% of the entire market capitalization of U.S. publicly traded companies. So 80%. So if you were to take all the outstanding shares of all these companies and sell them, 80% of that money is represented in the S&P. So it's a pretty good representation of generally what the stock markets are doing in America. That's why I like it. But again, hopefully on your commute home, on your commute to work, now you have a little bit better of an idea of what they mean by, the Dow's up, the Dow's down, the stock, the
Right.
S&P's up, it's down, or the Nasdaq is up or down. I'll give
And I
you the
think in
closing
yeah,
thoughts.
in closing, so when we're out there, I hear a lot of people say I'm investing in the S&P 500. You're not technically investing in the actual S&P 500 index. You're going out there and in your 401k accounts, your investment accounts, you have index funds, and that's what
Mhm.
you're actually investing in is the
Yeah,
funds.
that's good. The funds try to mimic the indexes. But sometimes if you read the prospectus of these funds, it might say something like 80% of the funds have to be invested in this
Hmm.
particular company, but 20% can go elsewhere. So it might not be an apples to apples
Right.
match. But generally they have these ETFs out there that they track the indexes pretty doggone close.
Right.
But that's what that is. So hopefully today you are a little bit more you know a little bit more about the stock market indexes than you knew before.
Great show, Eric. For those of you out there that are listening, if there's a question that you guys have and you want an answer to, email us, give us a call, let us know. We'd love to address those questions for you.
Yeah. Info@plan-wisely.com is where you can find us. Plan-wisely.com is our website. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to answer some of your questions. So y'all take care. Keep learning about money.